The rumble of the engine echoed through the hangar as soldiers hurried about their duties. Each hurried step reverberated as a reminder that in that environment, everything had to be earned, nothing was given. In the corner of the metal structure, a man approached the helicopter with steady steps but a calm gaze. No one knew exactly who he was, only that he had arrived at the last minute with an old backpack on his back. The Black Hawk would be launched on a crucial mission. Experienced pilots, technicians, and commanders were in position. Entry into the cockpit was restricted to the elite. When the man calmly asked to board, the laughter came like a storm. One of the mechanics, not hiding his mockery, asked if he at least knew the difference between a helicopter's control panel and a video game controller. The stranger did not react. He simply gripped the strap of his backpack tighter and looked directly at the captain in charge. The soldiers laughed even louder. One of them even offered him a broom, saying maybe he'd have better luck sweeping the hangar floor than trying to pilot an elite military aircraft. The humiliation grew like a fire. Sarcastic comments spread. Does he think this is a sightseeing tour? He must be lost. The circus is on the other side of the base. Even so, the man kept his calm gaze. His posture was that of someone carrying much more than that faded backpack suggested. The captain, about to dismiss him, hesitated for a moment. There was something strange in that serenity. It wasn't fear. It was familiarity, experience. But it was hard to believe that someone in such simple clothes, with no insignia, no visible ID badge, could have any authorization or relevance there. Outside the hangar, the late afternoon light painted everything gold. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The captain walked up to him and asked almost impatiently if he was aware of the type of mission underway. The man simply replied, "I am." That's when the captain pointed to the backpack and said, "Then show what you've got in there. If you have an ID or authorization, show it now. If not, turn around." All eyes turned to that moment. Silence took over the base. With deliberate slowness, the man opened the main zipper of the backpack. First, an old canteen appeared, then an aged flight glove. But what made the soldiers hold their breath was the metallic shine that emerged. Right after, rows of military medals, each with its dedication engraved by hand. The captain fell silent. He recognized at least 3 of those medals. They were extremely rare, reserved for classified operations, awarded to military men who had led missions of extreme risk. One of them, especially, was known as the Invisible Blade, a medal that only 7 pilots in the entire history of aviation had ever received. The laughter died. One of the soldiers stepped back, murmuring that it couldn't be true. Another recognized the pattern of an insignia folded next to the medals and whispered the name of a mission that had been kept secret for almost a decade. Now everything made sense. His posture, his calm, the silence. The captain, still stunned, asked his name. The man answered only with an alphanumeric code. That was enough. The captain took off his cap and stood at attention, a gesture that made everyone around fall completely silent. It was a gesture reserved only for living legends. The man did not return the salute. He simply closed the backpack again, passed by the captain, and walked to the helicopter door. No one else tried to stop him. No one else dared to say a word. The growing noise of the rotor now seemed like a silent anthem to the presence of someone who had stayed in the shadows for far too long. As he climbed into the cockpit, the eyes that had mocked him now followed him with reverence. He was one of the most legendary figures in combat aviation. His face had never been shown in the media. His name was known only at the highest levels of command. And yet, there he was, with an old backpack and the weight of history on his shoulders. The captain approached the co-pilot and said, "Let him take over. He's flown this more times than all of us put together." The co-pilot didn't hesitate. He got up from the seat and gave way. The man sat down, adjusted the controls like someone returning home, and faced the horizon. Outside, the base seemed frozen in time. Soldiers were still trying to understand what had just happened. The hangar that had been a stage for mockery was now an altar of silence and respect. The aircraft lifted off slowly. The man looked out the window like someone who knew exactly what was to come. And inside each soldier left on the ground, something had changed. Because that day, they learned that not every legend wears a spotless uniform. Not every hero demands recognition. The old backpack, which just minutes before had been the butt of jokes, had become a symbol of something everyone longed for: true respect. Respect that doesn't come from what you wear, but from what you've lived. The wind stirred up by the rotors seemed to erase every mocking laugh. Silence was now the only sound worthy of accompanying that man's takeoff. Those who laughed now lowered their heads. Not out of pity, but out of their own shame. The kind of lesson you don't learn in a classroom, but in the presence of someone who's already stared death in the face. And the man, sitting in the cockpit, didn't need recognition. He only needed to fly. Because the sky had always known who he was, even when the earth had forgotten. The wind cut through the sky as the Black Hawk moved away from the base, carrying not just equipment and crew, but also an atmosphere of silent respect that echoed through the radio frequencies. Inside the cockpit, the man adjusted each lever as if it were an extension of his own veins. The co-pilot, seated beside him, hardly dared to breathe too loudly, afraid to disrupt the concentration of someone who seemed to have fused with the helicopter. As the helicopter tore through the clouds, back at the base, the news spread like wildfire. Soldiers, technicians, sergeants, all talked about what they had witnessed. The man who had been ridiculed was in fact the ghost of operations no one dared mention without looking over their shoulder. Now that ghost flew above everyone's heads, reminding them that a pristine uniform doesn't always make the warrior. On the internal radio, the captain tried to keep his voice steady while going over mission details. It was a rescue infiltration. Conflicting information spoke of a hostage in hostile territory, a narrow time window, and adverse weather conditions. Nothing that intimidated the one now piloting with steady hands and a distant gaze. In the back seat, two younger soldiers exchanged glances. They were the same ones who had laughed first. One of them, still holding the broom he had offered as a joke, felt the shame burning hotter than the cold outside. Neither of them dared to lift their heads to face the pilot. Every jolt of the aircraft seemed to remind them just how wrong they had been. Down below, the terrain stretched out like a treacherous carpet. Dense forests, suspicious clearings, improvised runways. The Black Hawk flew low, scanning the horizon with state-of-the-art sensors. But more than technology, there was something no machine could provide: the instinct of someone who had already flown where no one else dared. The rescue team began to prepare. Equipment checked, weapons loaded, communication verified. Still, there lingered in the air a strange calm coming from the cockpit. It wasn't arrogance nor carelessness. It was the peace of someone who had faced the worst-case scenario and lived to tell the tale. As the man maneuvered, memories lit up in his mind like lanterns in a dark night. Faces of fallen comrades, screams drowned out by rotor blades, medals received in secret ceremonies. Every movement he made inside the cockpit was a silent tribute to those who had stayed behind. Outside, heavy clouds began to cover the sky. Gusts of wind tested the aircraft's balance, but he didn't slow down. On the contrary, he slightly tilted the helicopter, as if challenging the storm. To him, that turbulence was an old acquaintance, a reminder that the sky doesn't respect those who don't dare to face it. The co-pilot finally dared to ask a question. He wanted to know if he needed help recalibrating the route. The man simply pointed to a distant point beyond the clouds and said he had already mapped the way in his head. No GPS could beat his memory. On the ground, the support team tried to follow the route. On the monitors, the small light of the Black Hawk was followed by red dots, indicating risks. But inside the cockpit, the man wasn't concerned with markers. He read the terrain like one reads an old book. Every curve, every shadow, every whisper of wind was a clue. The radio crackled with an urgent message the enemy was aware of the operation and already mobilizing. Advance posts were being set up on the trails leading to the target. The risk of ambush was imminent. Any pilot would hesitate. Any regular pilot. He took a deep breath, adjusted his headset, and said without changing his tone, "We'll enter where they least expect." He didn't explain how. He just lowered the altitude, tilted the fuselage, and moved forward in absolute silence, as if the Black Hawk were a shadow gliding through the treetops. Down below, armed men began to appear in clearings. But it was already too late for them. When they heard the rotor's sound, the aircraft was already far off, cutting a path through crevices and valleys that seemed impossible to cross. The crew held their breath with every maneuver, certain they would brush against branches or rocks at any moment. But he passed through without a scratch. Every soldier on board felt the same. They were flying with someone who didn't just pilot machines. He piloted the impossible. Every second in there was a lesson. A silent lesson taught not through words, but through each lever adjustment, each precise glance, each contained breath. The approach to the target was imminent. The co-pilot received short instructions, almost whispers. Lock here. Check there. Breathe. Instructions that sounded more like advice from someone who already knew the outcome, but allowed each one to live their own courage. At the base, officers tried to make contact to abort. The radar showed a strong storm, winds that would bring down any unprepared aircraft. But inside the cockpit, the silence was answer enough. He wouldn't retreat. And contrary to what many thought, this wasn't recklessness, it was confidence built on a life of battles. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the man's face for brief moments. In those flashes, something could be seen in his eyes. A determination that didn't waver. For him, this mission wasn't just another one. It was perhaps the last chance to make every scar beneath his simple clothing count. When the Black Hawk finally hovered over the designated clearing, everything was ready. The soldiers jumped, sliding down ropes with precision. The man didn't move from the cockpit. He stayed, holding the aircraft in a delicate dance between cruel winds and branches threatening to rip through the rotors. A distant shot rang out. Then another. The man didn't take his eyes off the horizon. Inside him, every shot was a reminder. Life is measured by what you withstand standing, not by the applause you get when it's easy. Minutes felt like hours. The team on the ground moved quickly, but the hostility around them grew. Signals on. The radio indicated the enemy was approaching from side trails. The helicopter shook under the wind, but the man kept it steady, as if it were part of the terrain. Suddenly, an explosion echoed not far away. Trees shook, sparks scattered in the night sky. Still, the rotor maintained its exact rotation, as if nothing could break the pact between man and machine. Amid the chaos, a voice came through the radio. "We have the target. We're coming back." The man gripped the controls, took a deep breath, and lowered the Black Hawk a few meters, offering full cover for extraction. The soldiers emerged from the darkness, carrying not only the hostage, but also the certainty that, on that flight, they had witnessed something they would tell forever. When the last one stepped back into the aircraft, the man lifted the nose of the helicopter, gained altitude, and for a moment, it seemed the entire sky bowed to clear the way. As they pulled out of the conflict zone, no one dared speak. Silence was now the only tribute worthy of that pilot. Inside, the soldiers held on to one another. The rescued hostage, dazed, softly asked who the man was who had saved them. No one had a clear answer. Some simply said, "He's the one who flies when no one else dares." And as the Black Hawk disappeared beyond the trees, The base, in the distance, was already preparing to receive not just a successful rescue, but the return of a legend who never asked for medals. Because the medals, in the end, always stayed. Hidden in the backpack, in the memory, in the courage no one dares to imitate. The arrival at the base was silent, but loaded with tension. The helicopter touched the ground lightly, as if even gravity respected the one who piloted it. Before anyone from the ground crew could approach, the man shut off the engines and removed his headset like someone finishing an ancient ritual. None of the soldiers on board moved immediately. They were still under the effect of what they had just lived through. The captain was the first to approach. He wanted to greet him, thank him, maybe even apologize for not having recognized who he was from the start. But the man simply stood up, grabbed his backpack, and got out without saying a word. The captain remained silent. He knew that anything said there would seem small compared to what he had just witnessed. Outside, the wind still blew strong, but the base was already in full motion. The rescued hostage had been taken directly to the infirmary. High-ranking officers began to appear, drawn by the news that he had returned. But when they asked for a name or identity, no one really knew what to answer. One of the young soldiers who had mocked him earlier sat on the hangar floor, still with a shaken expression. The laughter from before had been replaced by an awkward silence. He watched the man's steps moving away, the backpack swaying lightly on his back, and felt as if he had watched a movie he would never forget. The man walked as if he already knew where to go, even without receiving orders. The truth was that, although technically outside the system, his presence still commanded absolute respect. No one dared to stop him, no one dared to ask. He had come back because he wanted to, and that alone said everything. The base commander, a decorated colonel, approached him with a grave expression. He had recognized the folded insignia the man carried in the side pocket of his backpack, an old identification from a special unit that had been dissolved for political reasons. Everyone who had served in it had been erased from the records. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" said the colonel, trying to start a conversation. The man stopped for a moment, stared at the horizon, and replied simply, "Not long enough to forget." Then he continued walking, as if words were obstacles. Between him and his destination, in the base mess hall, the whispers continued. Many knew stories, but no one had ever put a face to those legends. Some spoke of missions in deserts, others in snow-covered mountains. Everyone was certain he had survived the impossible more than once. Meanwhile, in a reserved room, files were reopened. Old photos, forgotten reports, encrypted recordings. There he was, younger, but with the same steady gaze. Missions stamped classified, came with dry descriptions and codes no one knew how to decipher anymore. It was as if he were a language that time had tried to erase, but that still resisted between the lines. In the infirmary, the hostage regained consciousness. He was a scientist, kidnapped months earlier during a field operation. Seeing the man enter the room, his eyes filled with tears. "You again," he murmured. The phrase left everyone perplexed. "Again?" He simply placed a canteen of water on the table and replied, "Last time was in the ice, now in the bush." He didn't explain anything else. The base doctor, who until then hadn't known who he was, stood there staring at the two, as if trying to piece together an international puzzle. Meanwhile, in the command room, the high command discussed what to do with that man. Officially, he didn't exist. But the successful operation called that into question. Someone suggested reintegrating him. Another, more cautious, said it would be better not to mess with things that had been buried. But none of them dared to confront him directly. It was like trying to command the wind. In the barracks, the man opened his backpack calmly for the first time. Besides the medals, there were folded photos, old letters, handwritten maps. Each item was a fragment of a life the world had tried to forget. He touched them like someone remembering without bitterness, but with firmness. There was honor in the remembrance. The young soldier who had offered him the broom gathered the courage to go to the barracks. He stopped at the door, hesitant. He wanted to apologize. But when he entered, the man was already asleep, lying down with no weapons, no vest, as if he could finally rest. The soldier left the broom there, next to the bed, now cleaned, with the handle painted olive green. It was his plea for forgiveness. The next morning, the base woke up to unusual movements. Intelligence officers had arrived. They brought with them files no one else accessed anymore. The base commander was informed that an emergency meeting would be held. The man would be summoned. But when they went to look for him in the barracks, he was already gone. All that remained was a note, handwritten. The mission is done. The rest is just vanity. There was no signature. Only the crest of the forgotten unit, sketched in graphite. With precision and lightness, they checked the cameras, the exit logs. Nothing. The helicopter was intact. No vehicle had left the site. It was as if he had dissolved into the wind, exactly as he had arrived. And deep down, no one was surprised. The young soldier looked at the broom and now saw in it not a reminder of mockery, but a symbol of redemption. He promised himself that he would become someone worthy of having been in the same helicopter as that man. And he would never again judge anyone by their appearance. In the archive room, the colonel spent hours rereading old reports. In all of them, one thing stood out. The way the man had always acted was the same. He arrived without being called. He fulfilled without failing, and he left without applause. As if glory were a burden he did not wish to carry. In the days that followed, more and more soldiers came to the hangar just to look at the Black Hawk. The seat where he had sat now seemed sacred. Some said they could never adjust the controls the same way. Others said the helicopter simply didn't fly the same with anyone else. Out of respect, the base commander ordered that helicopter to be retired from service and put on display. Not as a war machine, but as a memorial to a courage everyone had witnessed, and that no one could fully describe. Rumors began to spread to other bases. A man with an old backpack, deep eyes, and faded tattoos was said to have appeared at an airbase up north, watching a training session from afar. No one was sure. But the legend kept spreading. The rescued scientist was transferred to a maximum security unit. Before leaving, he left a phrase engraved on the infirmary door. If you're lucky, he shows up. If you have honor, he trusts you. If you have courage, he saves you. The phrase became a motto among the base soldiers. A few months later, a letter arrived at the base. No sender. Inside, a single sheet with coordinates and a phrase. The next storm isn't about weather. The commander understood. It was a warning, and a reminder that, wherever he was, the man was still watching. At the bottom of the barracks locker, hidden under the mattress he had used, an old photograph was found. In it, a team of 7 pilots, all smiling. In the bottom corner, handwritten, it said, "Spectral Unit, we fly where the maps end." The photograph was placed in a frame and hung at the hangar entrance, along with a plaque engraved with the phrase, "Here landed someone who didn't ask permission. He just delivered." Results. When the wind began to blow strong over the base again, weeks later, some soldiers felt a strange omen in the air, as if his presence could be sensed even before there was any evidence. The Black Hawk, now displayed as a mark of respect, still seemed to pulse memories through its metal walls. Anyone who passed by would lower their voice, as if it were forbidden to speak loudly near something so alive. In the control tower, the colonel was reviewing reports and intercepted messages. The coordinates that arrived in that anonymous letter pointed to a mountainous area, forgotten by ordinary maps. Satellites picked up nothing. Drones sent there returned with scrambled images, as if the region itself refused to be watched. But for those who understood tracks, that was a clear call. In the old barracks where the man had once rested, the young soldier who had left the broom kept the bed made as if he might return at any moment. It was a silent superstition. Between one cleaning and another, he whispered stories about the pilot no one dared name. And each story attracted more listeners. On the coldest night of that month, an unknown helicopter cut across the base's sky. It wasn't listed in any air traffic record. It had no visible markings. It hovered for moments over the hangar, then disappeared as quickly as it had come. Some soldiers swore they had seen, through the hatch, the familiar silhouette of a man, carrying a backpack. But no one had proof. Hours later, the colonel was awakened with an alert. Something had been left discreetly on the runway. A heavy envelope, marked only with the same forgotten crest, the insignia of the spectral unit. Inside were maps, precise coordinates, and a list of names. Folded between the papers, a single photograph. Him, younger, sitting on the wing of a fighter jet, smiling at someone outside the frame. The message was clear. More was coming. What seemed like a living legend was, in truth, part of something still in motion. A mission that had never been ended, only put to sleep, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And that moment had come. As the colonel took it all in, a new signal came through the radios. An urgent evacuation request at a forward base on the other side of the mountains marked on the map. The weather was hostile, communications unstable. No one could reach the area. No one, except someone who knew those invisible trails like lines in the palm of his hand. Without saying a word, the colonel authorized the mobilization. But a problem emerged. Who would fly? The historic Black Hawk was out of service. The other helicopters on the base were under maintenance. And yet, a small rescue team was already gathering in the hangar, as if they knew the improbable would happen. Outside, the clouds moved heavy, a sign of a storm that seemed to spring from nowhere. The faces of the young soldiers were tense, but there was also a silent faith. Maybe he would show up. Maybe not. But everyone knew, if anyone could cut through that closed sky, it was the man with the backpack. That's when the sound of rotors sliced through the dawn. An unmarked helicopter, painted in shades of gray, almost blending with the night, landed with millimeter precision in the center of the runway. The wind lifted dust, shook flags, stirred hearts. The side door opened slowly, and there he was. Once again, with worn boots, a uniform without insignias, and a backpack firm on his shoulders. No orders were needed. The soldiers formed an improvised line, opening a path for him to pass. The colonel, standing next to the displayed Black Hawk, watched in silence. Between the two men, just one look was enough. There was no conversation, no explanation. Everything had already been said in years of silence and metals kept hidden. He entered the cabin of the new helicopter, as if it were an old friend. The controls adjusted to his hands, obedient. The rescue team boarded in silence. Those left on the runway simply watched the rotor gain strength, lifting in a dance that defied the belief that man controls the machine. As they moved away from the base, the young soldier with the broom watched from the runway. This time there was no laughter, only eyes full of promise. He knew, like everyone there, that he was watching history happen again, in real time. And deep down, he made a silent vow. Next time, he would be on board too. The helicopter moved through the night like a discreet comet. Inside, the man looked over handwritten maps, lines only he understood. The co-pilot, assigned at the last minute, noticed something strange. Attached to the strap of the backpack was a small photo, the same old image of the team on the wing of the jet. A reminder that this was not just a mission, it was a legacy. Hours passed in the middle of the storm. The radio picked up fragments of distress calls, distorted signals. The man absorbed everything in silence. Each gust of wind was corrected by his precise touches. Each alert on the panel was answered with a nearly imperceptible but decisive maneuver. When they reached the extraction zone, emergency lights flickered in the darkness. The terrain was treacherous with no clear landing points. Any other pilot would hesitate, would look for a safe spot. Not him. He lowered the altitude, adjusted the angle, did the impossible once again, kept the helicopter hovering motionless. In the air, floating meters above the sloping ground, soldiers, wounded, were lifted one by one, like ghosts pulled back to life. Those climbing the rope didn't know who was in the cockpit. But when they turned their faces to say thank you, they saw only that calm profile, focused on the horizon, holding everyone in the air as if holding the world's breath. Gunshots echoed from the bush. Armed silhouettes tried to approach. The co-pilot panicked, but he did not. He turned the aircraft slightly, positioning the body as a shield. There, in the middle of the chaos, no one fell. No one was left behind. When the last soldier was pulled inside, he raised the nose of the machine. In a smooth gesture, defeating gravity, wind, and fire. And just as he had come, he disappeared among thick clouds, taking with him all those who for seconds had hung their lives on the firmness of his hands. Hours later, back at the base, the helicopter landed under rain. Doors opened. Lives were saved, but he was no longer there. Only the backpack, left on the seat, heavy with memories and empty of vanity. Inside it, a new note. When you need me, I'll come back. Until then, fly straight. Soldiers gathered around the aircraft, still in disbelief. The young man with the broom held the backpack against his chest as if it were a reliquary. In that moment, he understood that some people don't seek to be seen. They seek to be remembered in the form of courage they leave behind. And so, on the wet runway, the legend of a man who carried medals in his backpack and not on his chest was eternalized once again. Because, in the end, it wasn't the insignias that made him greater. It was what no one saw, but everyone felt when the sky opened just for him. If this story kept you here until now, honor this courage. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell, because there's much more living legend waiting to fly with you.